All right, Psalm 137. I know some of you have read it. Psalm 137 is, I used the word Sunday morning when I talked about the Old Testament. Said it gets grimy sometimes. Remember that? Psalm 137 is grimy. How many of you have ever had a family member who works, or you yourself, work in the medical industry? They're a doctor, they're a nurse. Yeah, some of you are. My grandmother, my mom's mom, Mimi, some of you have met her, was a nurse for a long time. This is the daughter of my great-grandma who just passed away at 105. And so Mimi was a nurse for, decades. And combine that with Mimi's personality, which tends to just be straightforward. It's probably the best way to say that. And when I say straightforward, I mean like straightforward to the max. You know how people who work in the medical industry really don't have any sort of body filter? Because they're around it all the time. So like gross stories aren't gross to them. The body is the body to them, no matter how personal it may be to you. It's a function of their job and life, and so they just don't have like the same empathy for maybe another person's sensitivity when it comes to blood stories. And blood stories blood doesn't bother me. Or maybe again, like maybe we start talking about the body and it gets personal. People in the medical industry don't just tend to have the same awkwardness that you might. Is that fair? Or life changes you. I remember, and some of you young men, unmarried, will probably you're probably here now. I remember before we had children, if I was observing or present when a lady was telling her birth stories about her children, which ladies love to do, I would leave. I didn't want to be there for that. Like I don't want to be part of that. It's beautiful, I know, but let it be beautiful for me one day, and I trust that it's beautiful for you. And of course, now that I've had 3, it's like, it is what it is. It's life, and it is beautiful in its own kind of grimy way, right? Again, you guys, one day you'll get it. Right now, it's like, I'm good. You talk about that somewhere else. I think the Old Testament can be like this. The Old Testament is straightforward to the max. Well, the Scriptures in general, but the Old Testament in general, in particular, straightforward to the max. And a lot of that is because it's a completely different, obviously, historical context and society. We are a much more sensitive culture when it comes to our personal comforts and our bodies and things like that. And we're more awkward about things. We're more uncomfortable about things. We're not as brutal a society. And so, whether you watch Kenneth Branagh's Henry V or The Gladiator or, those really brutal movies, those can bother some people because it's really brutal. The Old Testament is set in a culture of brutality. And so sometimes when we read it, that distance really bothers us because we don't really feel like it's as empathetic with us as it should be. Maybe like you're talking to somebody who works in the medical field. But like that person, there is good behind that, and we need to kind of press into that griminess sometimes. And truthfully, I have been dreading Psalm 137 for weeks because I think one of the most challenging verses in the Bible is in this text. And if you haven't read it, let's read it together. All right? Psalm 137. By the waters of Babylon, there we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. On the willows there we hung up our lyres, for there our captors required of us songs, and our tormentors mirth, saying, "Sing us one of the songs of Zion." How shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget its skill. Let my tongue stick to the roof of my mouth. If I do not remember you, if I do not set Jerusalem above my highest joy. Remember, O Lord, against the Edomites, the day of Jerusalem, how they said, lay it bare down to its foundations. O daughter of Babylon, doomed to be destroyed, blessed shall be he who repays you with what you have done to us. Blessed is the one who takes your little ones and dashes them against the rocks. And that's how it ends. So not only do we have a really difficult verse, that's how the whole text concludes. That's what you walk away with. So let's pray and study the passage. Father, we thank you for this psalm. We thank you for even in its intensity. We ask that you would use it in our hearts and lives as a source of encouragement. Help us to understand you better from it. Help us to understand ourselves. Help us to hate sin and long for home. And I ask these things through Christ. Amen. Well, I'm sure you noted the historical setting of this psalm. This is a very late written psalm because it is a psalm written in the exile. So, between like 700 and 300, okay? The Babylonian exile, Daniel takes place in the 500s, so it's during that time, but it's even more specific. It's probably like 600 to 300, okay? And so the historical time stamp on this psalm is very specific, much more than most of the other psalms. If there's a historical allusion in some of the other psalms, you're going, okay, it's probably, Psalm 56, David in the caves, and 1 Samuel 17 or something like that. Here, we know exactly when it is, and we know it was written by a writer in exile. Okay, we don't know who it is. I heard a preacher say one time, David was really feeling it when he wrote Psalm 137. It wasn't David. Okay, there's no way that it was David because they're in exile. David doesn't know anything about the Babylonian exile up until this point. It could have been that it was written by somebody later than the exile. I tend to think it was someone in the exile, but on the latter end of it. And the reason we know that is because they are, verse 1, by the waters of Babylon. So, by the waters of Babylon, there's a historical landmark there. The waters of Babylon is a convergence of multiple rivers, Tigris, Euphrates, and then smaller rivers and streams. And so this is actually a specific place that he is referencing. By the waters of Babylon, there we sat down and wept. What a happy beginning. There we sat down and wept. So visualize with me what's going on. I mean, the writer is with other people. Maybe he's remembering a time, or this is just a poetic narrative that he wrote to be sung. But the visual you're supposed to have in your mind is a small collection of his Jewish friends overlooking the rivers, just in grief, in deep grief. And why did they sit down and weep when we remembered Zion? They're quite literally longing for home. They're in exile. They've experienced the brutality of Babylon, the persecution, oppression of Edom. Let's just walk through the exile. I mean, many of the Jewish boys have been made eunuchs. Many of them put to death. Many of them watched their families slain when Israel's captured. And they have in their mind the glory of Israel, namely Zion. And they just want out. They just want out of Babylon. They just want to go home. On the willows there, we hung up our lyres. I mean, this is beautiful grief. This is beautiful grief. On the willows, we hung up our lyres. In other words, they walked by the trees, and they said, I can't do it. And they just put their instruments up on the limbs. So I can't rejoice. I can't sing right now. I can't play music right now. I don't know why it came to my head. Again, some of you are Lord of the Rings fans. In that scene in the Fellowship of the Ring where after Gandalf dies, spoiler alert, after Gandalf dies, they're in Lothlorien, the land of the elves, and the elves are singing. And someone asks one of the elves, what are they saying? And he says, I can't tell you, the grief is still too near for me. This is the scene that came to my mind. They're in this forest, surrounded, it's beautiful, and they just can't talk about it. I mean, it's too much. And to add literal insult to injury, a few Babylonians walk by, laughing. Hey, verse 3, sing us a song of Zion. Sing us a song of your land. So now there is the internal grief of missing home, longing for the better days, the days of shalom, the days of the good kings. I mean, as good as they were, David and Solomon and some of the others. They're remembering the good times in Zion, and there were some of those. And they're grieving, and their enemies, their captors, said, hey, sing. But verse 2 says they can't sing. So verse 3, they're grieving, and they're being mocked in their grief. Can you imagine if you were at a funeral and someone started making fun of the loved one who'd passed away? Can you imagine that? What would that do inside you? Probably righteous rage, right? That's the kind of thing that takes place here. They're grieving over a lost home. And those who took their home away are now saying, hey, why don't you sing us one of your pretty songs? After they put up their instruments. So verses 1 through 3 begin with memories and mockery. What a difficult experience. What a spiritual struggle. Have you ever asked yourself, God, why are we here? Why here? Why now? Why with these people, maybe? That's the underlying heart question of verses 1 through 3. Why here? Why are these beautiful memories that we have tainted with grief and then spoiled by the mockery of our captors? And the reason this grief is so difficult and this mockery is so painful is verses 4 through 6. That they have a deep love for the land. So they're pushed to sing by their captors, verse 3, and outpours in these lyrics of the song, outpours the inside of the writer's emotions and heart and thinking. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? How can we do that? So verses 4 through 6, the love for the land. Verses 1 through 3, memories and mockery. Verses 4 through 6, it's so painful because of their love for their homeland. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget its skill. And the skill there is specific back up to verse 2. The harp. The lyre is a form of harp, by the way. So he says, if I forget the glory of Jerusalem, make me forget how to play my instrument. I have nothing to rejoice. No source of joy and reason to play my instrument or sing a song if I forget the glory of Jerusalem. Let the tongue stick to the roof of my mouth. Literally, don't let me sing. If I do not remember you, if I do not set Jerusalem above my highest joy. Perhaps, again, you've been in a situation so difficult where your heart forgot how to sing. You thought song would never return to you. Sunday morning was going to be hard, man, because you didn't want to sing songs of rejoicing. You weren't ready for that. How shall we sing songs in a foreign land? I'd rather not be able to play the instrument or sing at all than forget the glory of the peace that we had there. Memories and mockery, love for the land, and finally, this is where we begin to lean into have to press in to the distance, the historical distance, the tribal battle distance from the psalm, from us to the text and from the text to us. We don't use terms like this. We don't think in this way anymore because we're not a warring society. Remember, O Lord, against the Edomites, the day of Jerusalem. So this is the first reference to a historical event in the Old Testament. And so he is referring to the attack of the Edomites, which is outlined for us in Isaiah 34 and Ezekiel 35. How they laid siege against Jerusalem, how they lay it bare, how they said, lay it bare down to its foundations, raze it to the ground, R-A-Z-E, obviously. Take it down so that people can't not only live there anymore, but see it anymore. And don't spare life. O daughter of Babylon, doomed to be destroyed, blessed shall be he who repays you with what you have done to us. So at his anger for the Edomites, and the Babylonians, motivated by his love for the land, he requests that righteous retribution be brought upon these lands, upon the enemies of God. The request for retribution. And Babylon becomes the primary the primary object of his desire for vengeance, righteous vengeance. Obviously, we know this because this is where they are, verse 1, and because he gives 2 verses to the retribution on Babylon in verses 8 and 9. Doomed to be destroyed. Now, he says doomed to be destroyed, not hopefully, but certainly, because there are prophecies outlining the destruction of Babylon, actually even using this exact terminology. In Isaiah 13:16, if you want to go there with me, we're going to encounter this phrase again that the psalmist uses. I think it'll be helpful for you to see this, Isaiah 13:16. Again, not necessarily a happy text, but I think it'd be good for you to see this so that we are not moved to an anger necessarily for the writer here. Verse 16, the first line of the psalm says, their infants will be dashed to pieces before their eyes. So literally what the psalmist is saying in verse 9 is he is asking that God's will would be done, because Isaiah 13 is a prophecy given by God regarding the Babylonians. So Isaiah 13 is the oracle that Isaiah gives, saying, here's what's going to happen to Babylon. So Psalm 137, verse 9, is in agreement with Isaiah 13:16. It's the writer of the Psalms' way of saying, God, do what you said you're going to do. You say, why in the world would God even use this terminology? Would the Word even use this terminology? Look at verse 8. What does it say? Blessed shall be he who repays you with what you have, what to say, done to us. verse 9, as awful as it is, and the visuals that come to your mind, no doubt disturbing, is not a practice primarily of Yahweh and Israel. It's a practice of Babylon. This is something the ancient Babylonians would do, Assyrians would do, and the Assyrians would do when they conquered a city to young children. So what the psalmist is saying is, God, do to them what they have done to us. And he is asking that God keep his word, because God has said in Isaiah 13 that he would do this, which also lets us know that this psalm is not, and this is very important that you hear this, there is no moral issue with this psalm, because this is not actually the psalmist asking for vengeance that he would accomplish himself. This is the writer rightly understanding that vengeance alone belongs to God, because he wants what God says is going to be done to be done. God says he's going to do it, and the writer wants it to be done. So he is not himself desiring that he enact vengeance so much as recognizing that God alone is the one who rightfully deals out vengeance. His understanding of God is correct. And again, even as we lean into this, it makes us uncomfortable, because we don't like this view of a God who might, again, be outside of our sensitivities or our understanding. And I think the first thing that we have to do is just, and this is the why I started the way that I did, just concede that there was an original audience here, and it's not you and me. Okay? We are benefactors of the writers, but the original audience is who? The Jewish people who need to sing this. The Jewish people who are looking forward to home, looking back to home. The Jewish people who are pleading for a return to home. And the Jewish people who have been through it with Babylon and desire that God would pour out his righteous wrath on them. The Jewish people who have seen God pour out his righteous wrath before on their behalf. So we shouldn't take our 21st century American sensitivities and read it into the passage and then go, I don't. When in reality, we should look at the text and say, okay, it's not like I love it. It's not like it makes me happy. But what does it show me about God in its timeless application? Because the Scripture applies timelessly. And so I want to leave you with two applications that I think the text points us to. And I actually think that we end up in a really joyful place. So to summarize it and then to break down these applications, I would say Psalm 137 teaches us that joy in God causes hatred for sin and hope in our home. Joy in God causes hatred for sin and hope in our home. So where do you get those ideas? Well, what's missing from the text? Obviously, joy. And why is it missing? For two reasons. One, the sin of Israel. Now, this is where it'd be really easy to say, well, it was the sin of Babylon that was inflicted upon them. But you have to remember what God says to Samuel. We'll get that in 2 Samuel. And to Isaiah and to Jeremiah. They're going to be taken, and they're going to be taken because they turned to false gods. So it was Israel's own sin, their own rebellion against God, that caused captivity. And captivity occurs, exile occurs, when we have been so rebellious towards God that we communicate to Him we would rather Him not be in the picture at all. In which case, occasionally, He takes a step back, which is the most dangerous place for the children of God to be. It has been said before, and I've said it when I'm preaching the Old Testament, I'm sure. The true wrath of God is when He is silent, is when He steps out of the picture. and turns us over to ourselves. So what do you say to Israel? You keep the terms of the covenant, you will know the blessings of my protection. I will keep you, I'll bear you on eagle's wings. But they didn't. And so this sin, their own sin, causes a longing for home. Now there's a certain horizontal application that we see here. That being said, their hatred, or their desire, is a better way to say it, their desire for vindication is still a righteous desire. Their sin does not cancel out the sin of Babylon upon them, the cruelty of Babylon upon them. God will still deal with that, and he does. Isaiah 13:16 takes place. So the first thing that the psalm should cause us to do is analyze ourselves, to look in, and say, do I hate sin in such a way that I would cause myself, or do I hate sin in such a way that I would avoid this kind of grief? Because if we hate sin, we're not going to feel the effects of spiritual exile, because we're never going to be there to begin with. If we hate sin, we're not going to know the grief of separation from the Father. Of course, you know I mean sanctification separation, not salvation separation. Because we're never going to be there to begin with. We're not going to let ourselves get in that opportunity or that situation. So the text, first of all, causes us to hate sin. And so, much the same way that we talked about Sunday morning, do you regularly cleanse your hands as a sinner and purify your hearts? And, James, the New Testament writer, is very straightforward, again, to use the common theme. And in that passage, he calls them names. I won't do it to you because cleanse your hands, you sinners. Purify your hearts, you double-minded. He's talking to the church. And he's already said in chapter 1, a double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. Do you and I regularly bring our sins before the Lord, honestly? Or do we only hate our sin reactively, when we're in the bad place? Do we have a hatred of our sin that causes us to be before the Father confessing regularly and intentionally, rather than only when we mess up? Are we in a place where we are regularly making certain our heart is pure? And one of the ways in which we will ensure that our heart is pure is to ask God to give us a love for His holiness, an awe for His holiness, so that it results in an absolute hatred for our own sin. Say, I hate my sin. Okay, when your spouse points it out to you, do you justify yourself or do you confess? I got really frustrated the other day. Something happened. I don't even remember what happened. But my kids were around. And I try really hard not to use this phrase, but I did. And I got really frustrated. I said, I'm done. And I just needed some space, and I walked away. The next day, Everly got mad at her brother. You know what she said? And literally, it just caused pain right here. It's like, oh. So I walked over to her, and I said, Everly, did you say that because you heard Daddy say that? And she said, yeah. I said, Evie, do you remember that I apologized to you for saying that? And she was like, yeah. I said, well, maybe you shouldn't say it either, right? But in that moment, everything in me wanted to go, oh, she heard that before me yesterday. She didn't learn that from me, but I knew she did, because I'd never heard her say it before. 1 + 1. When your sin is pointed out to you, How resistant are you to your sin? If someone pokes at the blind spot, and you just fundamentally can't believe that you even have that blind spot because you're blind to it, how do you respond? No, you got me all wrong. You don't understand. This happened, and then we begin to justify. What if that person actually sees what we don't? You know what a bitter person does? A bitter person gets bitter against that person because the bubble of perfection got poked. And then we start justifying, they don't understand me, they don't know me, when in reality, maybe they just know you in that area better than you know you. Do we really hate our sin, or do we just say we do? Joy in God causes hatred for our sin, grief over our sin. And it causes what the psalmist is missing. Again, this is the beauty of the grief. It is grief and sadness, but it's painted in such a beautiful way. And it's just the longing for home that we see in the text. So the application of the text, first of all, the psalm teaches us a hatred for sin. And the second thing it teaches is a holy homesickness, a holy form of homesickness. Listen, this is really important. Growing Christians become increasingly homesick for heaven. Growing Christians become increasingly homesick. And the reason we know this is because Christians that are either not growing or Christians that are standing still regularly become more attached to the world. And so, we've all done this. We go through the evolutions of growing up, right? And I used to think as a teenager, no, I want Jesus to come back, but not till after I get married. And then I want Jesus to come back, but not till after I have kids. And then I want Jesus to come back, not till after they're saved. And then I want Jesus to come back, and then, we go through that whole thing. And I heard a professor say one time, and at first I just thought he was, wrong, because I was a college student and I know everything. That anything you want more than for Jesus to come back is probably an idol. It's like, that's crazy. My desires are good. What do I want more than Jesus? What do I want more than Jesus? What do I want more than the new heaven and new earth? I mean, I know where that gets us. I know the road that we have to go down that's a hard road to look down, but what does Jesus say about being a disciple? I mean, we have to love him first. And that includes even over our good desires. What does he say, verse 6? The end of verse 6. If I do not set Jerusalem above my highest joy. His longing to return to the good old days are more than just the comfort of shalom, the comfort of Israel, and the discomfort. It's more than that. Because what is the glory of God in Israel? It is God's presence in Zion. And so this is a spiritual desire. His highest joy here is that Israel would be back where they should be in every way. And if Israel is where they should be in every way, they are in union with Yahweh. They're enjoying Zion. They're enjoying God in the tabernacle. They're pure before Him. So what have we set above our highest joy? I said it a few weeks ago on a Sunday morning, I believe I did. I think one of the reasons this world is so disappointing is because we live for it. We've attached too many roots here. We have too many strings tying us to the temporal. The people of God understand that every climactic joy is a future one. The greatest significance of our hope is when it is fulfilled. Now, both in its temporal, both in its immediate fulfillment, Israel would go back to the land. They would be restored. And it's at least in my theology and the many that I agree with, that I believe that Israel again will be back in the land. But what about us? Do you have such a hatred for sin that you would passionately desire to fight against it the way that the writer hates those who oppress Israel? Most writers, by the way, most modern commentators take imprecations like this, imprecatory psalms like verse 9, and they say this is how you should feel about spiritual warfare. In other words, make sure you're fighting the right enemy. Make sure you hate Satan and his followers who are oppressing us until we wait for heaven as much as these people hated their oppressors in exile. How often do we end up fighting a bad battle just because we're not hating the right enemy? We're not fighting the right enemy. And that's how church splits happen. That's how family conflict ensues. We've taken our eyes off who we're supposed to be fighting. We've taken our eyes off of our future because our heart is too deeply settling us here. Now, the greatest thing about this psalm is what's not written here. What's not written here is that Israel would be restored, that the heart's cry of the writer would be answered, whether in his generation or his children's. They would go back to the land, and the land would be rebuilt slowly but surely. And the heart cry of the writer will be absolutely fulfilled. We will all one day be sitting by still waters in green pastures. And there, we will sing songs of joy in the land.